Hi, everyone. Welcome and good day to all, whatever time it may be in your time zone. For many years now, we have watched the education profession falter. Too few people coming into the profession, too many places around the globe with unqualified and underqualified teachers, and too many qualified teachers leaving the profession too soon. I'm Carol Basile. I'm the Dean of the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. And today we're going to talk about the normal, but what we hope will be what we would say is the next normal: learning teams, global evidence, and impact. What we have always thought about is normal: teachers who know how to be able to do everything, novices who can walk into a classroom and be day one ready, alternatively certified teachers who would get us more high quality teachers faster, more, and dare I say more, professional learning, standards, curricular changes that we believe would ultimately solve all the problems. None of these can be the norm anymore. It is not working. The norm that I find probably most egregious, the one that we have been talking about now for a number of years, not just since the pandemic or because of the pandemic, is really the isolating and inflexible working and learning environment of educators, otherwise known as the one teacher, one classroom, or egg crate model of education. And for many reasons, I find it to be unreasonable and probably immoral that we take a young teacher, we put them in a classroom, and we say, you have to know everything and be everything for all of the students in that classroom. It's time to start thinking about how we change that learning environment for both teachers and for learners. And by doing so, also change so much more. Education, we know, depends on quality educators. So we are asking, what if we could design a system that is equitable for both teachers and learners? It's time to think about what we need, not as a recruitment and retention problem, but as a workforce design problem. What if those of us who prepare, certify, deploy, fund teacher preparation programs, think about teachers, think about schools, could now think hard about this and what it means for our work and our programs? Today, learners actually need teams of people who can distribute expertise, personalize learning, and deepen learning. The pandemic has just exacerbated all of this, made this more important today than it probably ever has been. Educators need the professional satisfaction and efficacy that comes from working in self-improving teams of adults to solve problems together. And they need meaningful advancement pathways to different and potentially new kinds of roles. The whole system needs a research agenda that addresses questions of this systemic performance. Ultimately, the question becomes, if we're not getting the education workforce or the learning outcomes that we want, can we redesign the profession, the workplace, and how we prepare people for both? At Arizona State University, we've been working on this for the past 4 years. Restructuring teacher and leadership preparation, we're helping reorganize schools and educators into teams across multiple classrooms. We're finding ways to think about how we distribute the expertise of teachers on teams, creating advancement opportunities, working with experts on personalized, competency-based, and deeper learning, and providing teacher candidates with more specializations in paid and non-paid team-based residencies, and much more. As we work to change working and learning environments for professional educators, we're also thinking about how to empower community members and parents to complement the work of teachers and schools. Our schools desperately need people, but they desperately need people who are trained in a consistent manner, who have a toolkit of effective instructional practices. It also means that we get smarter and better at using technology as part of the team to create high-tech, high-touch environments. So imagine for a moment that we could break the one teacher, one classroom model, that we could leverage all of our assets in new ways, working with partners, to actually create a new kind of superstructure. Today, we have an opportunity to take this conversation to the next level, to think about teams and how those teams can actually close gaps for so many learners. I want to thank Katie Godwin at the Education Commission and Brett Madden on my team for engaging us in this conversation. Thank you to the rest of the Education Commission team, Lisbeth, Amy, Charlotte, Anna. Thank you to all of our guests who are speaking today and contributing to this really important conversation. And thanks to all of you for your interest and your participation. We will start today with a keynote conversation, and then we will hear about evidence to support learning teams. which will be followed then by 3 global case studies of how learning team approaches have been used in different contexts. And we'll finish with a question and answer period with speakers to discuss how to move forward with learning team approaches. Please remember, include any questions or comments in the chat throughout the event, and we hope you enjoy our time together. Lisbeth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today. My name is Lisbeth Stier. I am the director of the Education Commission, and I am so excited to be joined by Carol and Lucy today because you are really our heroes. Carol, you talked about 4 years ago, when we started thinking about this idea of learning teams, when we were back in the day starting the research work and the report, we were scouring the world for people who were like-minded. And it was actually hard to find. And I remember the excitement that we had when we found you in Arizona State University, and I remember visiting you. And we thought, wow, actually, there are other people thinking exactly in the same way. And it's hard to find that at the moment, but it was a real point of light for us. And we were really impressed by the way you didn't only look at this concept in Arizona State University itself, but also how you are working with local disadvantaged communities in Arizona State, which for us who are working in developing countries, we thought that's where all the problems are. We need to concentrate there, but actually there's a lot we can learn also from high-income country contexts and disadvantaged communities within even very advanced countries like the United States. So first of all, I want to thank you, Carol, because you've been an inspiration to us, and all the work you've been doing has been wonderful to also advance these ideas. And then I also want to introduce, of course, Lucy Lake, the CEO of CAMFED. I'm sure many of you, probably most of you, will know Lucy, but she has been guiding this incredible organization, CAMFED, that has worked with disadvantaged girls around the world, has reached millions of girls by using very innovative approaches, and has in the process also created a generation of women leaders. And Lucy, you are part of the global women leaders. You've got lots of prizes. You were awarded the Yidan Prize. Even the Queen of England gave you an honor. People really have appreciated the work you have done, and so have we. So we're incredibly grateful to have you here today. So the Education Commission flagship report called the Education Workforce, Transforming the Education Workforce, came up with a new approach, or the approach that was mentioned also by Carol, where we were looking at how could we indeed think about learning teams instead of just teachers to help us address some of the most pressing problems in education, whether that's achieving even foundational learning, whether that's getting to the most marginalized and those left behind, or whether that is actually offering greater personalized learning, making sure that we can adjust our teaching to the level of the learners. So the learning team approach is such a shift because it actually moves us from thinking as we did and have been doing over many years of teachers at the center, and really trying to think about how we can strengthen the teacher at the center with all the children around him or her, to saying, let's just take the learner at the center and then think about all the people that we need to surround the learner with, including very important teachers, but have look at other types of professionals as well that can help and support that teacher. So EWI, the Education Workforce Initiative of the Commission over the past few years, has been bringing together evidence from around the world to see where is this kind of approach already happening. And we've not only looked at education, but also at health and early childhood development where this is a more common way of doing things. And as I said, ASU's Next Education Workforce Initiative, as well as CAMFED, have been huge inspirations in this. So I'll turn now to my two wonderful guests and try and get some information out of you. And Carol, I'd like to start with you. Because why do you think this is relevant today to us, maybe even in the pandemic, much more so? Why is it relevant to take this approach to improve our education systems? You're on mute, Carol. Yes, great.
You know, so much of what people don't see or understand, I think, is that our education systems today are not sustainable the way that they are. That if we continue to have what we always talk about is teacher shortage, but unqualified, underqualified, not enough teachers, we're bringing bodies in to be in a classroom. The education system is simply not sustainable. And so as we talk about teachers on teams and building teams, we are talking about fundamentally changing both the working environment and the learning environment at the same time. Somebody said to me the other day, it's a double bottom line for us. It's always about teachers and about learners. And we think that this approach, as we have really kind of gotten more and more engrossed in it and looking at what happens and how it happens, is one, it ends up being more inclusive. It allows for greater diversity of people to surround children, including people who look like them. It brings teams, you know, different curricular cultural perspective together as knowledge and resource. It's personalizing learning for students, as we're seeing students now that have been out of school, particularly now, right? We see disparity that is growing. We're going to have to pay attention to how we personalize, how we deepen learning, how we better understand need. That teams mean that time taken with individual issues, right, don't take learning time away from all, that learners get the attention that they need for diagnosis, for care, for understanding, for learning, for opening more doors, for more access to resources. And distributed expertise means, right, that you don't have one teacher with many different, you know, expertise in different rooms. Now you're able to actually utilize that expertise in one place on a team. Teachers begin to work the same way that the rest of us work in organizations where we all distribute expertise. So this change in the learning and working condition, I think, is significant if we are actually to sustain the education system across the globe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That is a really good summary. Lucy, tell us a bit about CAMFED. What is it? What does it do? How is this learning team approach relevant to it? And how do you think has this been really important to reach actually those that are furthest behind?
Sure, thanks, Lisbeth. And just to say that I think we have very much valued the opportunity to engage with the Education Commission around this and actually to find a community which is exploring and bringing to the fore the whole issue of learning teams. So at CAMFED, our learning team approach has really developed right from the outset. And currently it's centered on a role known as a learner guide. She's a recent female school graduate who returns to her local school and signs up to an 18-month commitment to deliver a complementary curriculum, complementary to the academic curriculum, that's focused on life skills and well-being and is integrated into the school timetable. And she's assessed for her pedagogical practice and receives accreditation, which in turn enables her transition into formal teacher training or employment. And how she's positioned, and to pick up on Carol's point, is very important because she's not low cost, unqualified teaching workforce. It's very important that she's positioned in to play a particular role in supporting and delivering a curriculum around well-being. That it is important that she's seen as being part of a team who is linked to school authorities, linked to teachers, and linked to other authorities. Because what she is able to do is really engage with some of the invisible issues, the invisible challenges that are impeding the most marginalized children from again engaging effectively in the classroom and learning. So one example of that is academic self-esteem, which we found in our work was the second highest cause of dropout among girls after poverty-related reasons. And the presence of learner guides within the school system can help surface these issues. And because she's part of a team who is connected with teachers, with school authorities and with other local authorities, has the network to be able to deal with these issues. And I mean, just as a final note, Elizabeth, you raised the issue of the pandemic. I think what we've seen recently and through these last few months is that learning teams are there already within communities. And I think that the pandemic has really exposed that. But often these learning teams are informal, they're unresourced, they're carried by women within the community. And I think that now is a moment to really bring more attention and spotlight and resource behind them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in that way, the pandemic has helped actually move this issue forward. And I also fully agree with you that I think what this also has done is emphasize that learning is more than just the academics. There is so much more that needs to be taken care of during a learning process. And you need different types of people to do that. So that's a really important element. Carol, the impact, obviously, of this new concept is huge on the education workforce itself, and included in that on the teachers. How is that affecting the way you or the way you see within the Teachers College, but also more broadly, how do you see that affecting the training and development of teachers?
So I think, it's interesting, again, we always look at, we spend a lot of time looking at what the normal is and then think about, okay, what shouldn't be the normal anymore. When you look at the normal of teacher preparation, where you take your classes, do your clinical experience, maybe it's a semester, maybe it's a year, with a mentor teacher. And whoever your mentor teacher is who you become, because experience trumps the courses. There are rarely electives in teacher preparation. It tends to be very prescriptive in terms of what you need to know and be able to do based on a set of standards from, in our case, the state, sometimes the ministry. There are skills that we do not teach because we're training for a one teacher, one classroom model. So whenever you think about what you're training for and the environment, that's what those are the skills you're going to focus on. But I think there's a whole lot of other skills. Supervision has always been about the individual and individual assets and the requirements that I think are impossible. It's a very long list when we look at what the expectations are. So the minute that you start to think about teams, it's a game changer for teacher preparation. Now, teacher preparation has to think about a new way to work with partners that leverages assets in new ways, and pushes on the system in some very different ways. It means teacher preparation has to change, schools have to change. We really get to what I think John Goodlad always said was about simultaneous renewal, that we are changing, universities are changing, but schools also, we're pushing schools to actually look different, feel different, create new kinds of learning environments. And the model also pushes teacher preparation to think about teachers via teams. Now, how do we create specializations early in teacher candidates' journey? How can we build more experience for teacher candidates and move away from the one teacher candidate, one mentor model? So now how are they being prepared in teams? And alleviates problems of always having to find the perfect mentor. Supervision now is about individuals, but it's also about new skills, about how teacher candidates work on teams. What does that mean? How do they team? How do they distribute expertise? How do they personalize? So many other kinds of things now we think about in terms of what teachers need to know and be able to do. And on the school side, now we're also having to think about how we train classroom teachers in new ways and what clinical experience looks like, and who are those teachers that are now working with teacher candidates. and how do they distribute expertise and personalize learning? It's a big shift on both sides. It will be a tremendous shift for teacher preparation, but no time like the present.
Yeah, that is certainly true. So, Lucy, this actually seems very complicated. So I could imagine someone looking at this and saying, well, this is having just a teacher to train and then deploying that teacher seems much simpler. So given the complication of this, how do you actually scale something like that? And how do you scale it also in a developing country context, which you've clearly done? We'd love to hear about what your experience has been, especially in these difficult areas you've been working with.
Sure, Elizabeth. Well, actually, I think that a local learning teams approach, I think by definition allows for scale, because it allows for the system to be responsive locally to local need. So I think the fact that it is powered locally is why it can scale. And that's why I think as we consider scaling, I think it's really important that we don't explore this in a top-down way of introducing a model, that it has to be very much about resourcing a bottom-up approach to learning teams. And just going back to the point of the fact that I think in the recent months we've seen these informal learning teams emerge, I think there is an opportunity now to bring more definition and more resource behind that. And I think that's why we're going to be able to be in a position to scale. And I think as well that in terms of scaling within government systems, that's also going to take a broader conversation that goes beyond education, to recognize that this is a cross-sectoral approach, and it's going to require that we really break down more into components and what is required within a learning team, what can be achieved within a learning team. So the learner guide that I described is very relevant to ministries of youth and employment, for example, in exploring ways in which school graduates can become meaningfully engaged within a learning team. And so I think there is an opportunity to be able to explore in the scaling process and with governments and how we can take this out and beyond education, and thereby find new and different kinds of resources to bring to the table behind learning teams.
Yeah, I think you make an incredible important point there about the need to embed things in government systems as well, or in systems as a whole. And it is that sort of bottom-up, top-down approach. Just to close, maybe Carol, could you tell us a little bit about that, how that has concretely happened or is happening in Arizona State? How do you embed something innovative like this in entire systems that are pretty large, even in just one state in the United States?
You find the willing. Right? I mean, it's always the case, I think, whenever you're trying anything new. We found 14 districts here, right, who said, that's interesting, and we're moving ahead. And it's small, right? All of them, they look very different. We've given people a lot of leeway. We're now trying to figure out how to manage all of that. But we now have the largest district in the state that's saying, no, we want 50% of our schools to be next education workforce schools in 2 years. So people are seeing, I think, the benefits of this. And I think understanding that we cannot continue the way that we have been. And you go with those who are getting on board. We're seeing the cracks in the normal. If the pandemic has done anything, it has helped us really illuminate the things that we've seen for years, but we've virtually ignored. And we can't ignore this inequality for any longer. It has got to be all hands on deck. And that means, we're training community members, and as Lucy says, and we're thinking very differently about the roles that people play, who's on these teams. This is not just teachers. This is really thinking very, very differently.
Yeah, Lucy, you want to, as a closing remark, also say something about kind of the pandemic issue. How are we now going to actually take this as an opportunity, something that has been devastating for the education sector? How do you do that within Comfort? How are you bringing evidence together? How are you trying to capture this moment and use it to propel ourselves into this next or the new normal or the next sort of way of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely, Elizabeth. And just to pick up on Carol's point, I think if we're going to achieve the system change, it is about finding the champions of change within the system who can be that driving force. And to your point, I think as we garner the evidence for the kind of learning teams approach over the recent period, I think there's going to be a lot to be able to consider. So, for example, in terms of the return rate to school among the most marginalised girls, where we've had learning teams in place, we've seen return rates up to 20% higher than national averages, and these are among the most marginalised groups. And I think it really demonstrates the importance of learning teams in that outreach and that support that goes beyond the school system in a context of school closure to ensure that children have that continuity of support within and beyond the school community. So I think that the evidence that we're going to be able to gather as an education community is going to be fundamental to being able to position this for a next stage.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful, and we really hope that that we can indeed help also bring all of this together. So I will turn to my colleague Amy Bellinger, who has been leading this work for the Commission for a number of years, and she will tell us a little bit more about what on earth are these learning teams we've been talking about. Amy, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Lisbeth, and thank you so much, Carol and Lucy. It's fantastic to have this concept brought to life very, very early on. So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining our learning event, Learning Teams event today. I'm just going to take you through a few slides that explain how we developed the Learning Teams concept and the evidence that supports it. We'll then hear from 3 fantastic examples of forms of learning teams in practice. Next slide, please. So we had our early inspiration for this from the Education Commission's Learning Generation report in 2016, which made a recommendation to expand, strengthen and diversify the education workforce. This was inspired by the health sector's approach to workforce design, where a far more diversified workforce is deployed with distinct and recognised professionals, each with their own skills and training that allows them to meet the needs of all their patients. And this has led to a more cost-effective workforce with improved health outcomes. The chart shows that in Chile, for example, there are 5 medical support staff for 1 doctor, while there is less than half of a teaching support staff for every teacher. Next slide, please. So this recommendation led to the launch of the Education Workforce Initiative and our Transforming the Education Workforce report. This put forward 3 interacting, iterative, adaptable visions for a systemic approach to the education workforce, able to address learning, equity, and inclusion. The visions put forward include a strengthened education workforce through incremental change to address immediate challenges around recruitment, preparation, development, and management. The second vision was a shift to a more collaborative education workforce through developing learning teams. And the final vision is a more radical paradigm shifting vision about transforming education systems into learning systems. And today we'll focus on learning teams. But just to say that creating learning teams was also an action included in the Save Our Future white paper, which was written this summer and consulted hundreds of organisations on evidence and actions to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And we're now really keen to work with countries and other partners to make that action a reality. Next slide, please. So why create learning teams? Well, Carol has already talked about this a lot at the beginning, but just really to touch on a couple of points. So teachers are in short supply and often don't receive the educational support they need to be effective in their jobs. And as Carol said, workforce design is still based on a 1 teacher to 1 class model that was created for standardization rather than personalization. Some of the best systems have started to innovate and adapt beyond this model. And now the pandemic with wider global trends are changing the understanding of what teaching and learning can look like, which provides an opportunity for new approaches. Classroom teachers, as Carol says, are often tasked with understanding and meeting extremely diverse needs, such as those of first-generation learners, those who speak multiple languages, have had interrupted education and special needs, often with training that is very generic, large class sizes and little support. The COVID-19 crisis has affected millions of teachers and students worldwide, leading to huge predicted learning losses, but it has shown that teachers can no longer work alone. The case studies you will hear from today show that during COVID-19, where there were forms of learning teams in place, learning was able to continue, demonstrating that learning disruption is preventable if different roles within and outside school can work together as a team. Next slide, please. So what is a learning team approach? As Lisbeth said, this is about shifting the class design from the teacher at the centre surrounded by students to a learning team design where the learner is at the centre, supported by a collaborative team of professionals. These teams of professionals would leverage a variety of expertise and experience to collectively focus on improving the learning and inclusion of all students, and at the same time, they would be able to continually learn themselves. This means that the diverse needs of students can be met, but it also means that teachers can focus on teaching and have greater support. Using a learning teams approach is about investing in the social capital as well as the human capital of the workforce. Next slide. So this concept is based on a growing body of evidence that shows how different roles working together can together improve teaching, learning and inclusion. The evidence suggests that there are improved learning outcomes when teaching assistants and learning support staff with training support individual pupils or small groups using a specified approach. And you will hear shortly about the Learning Assistant Programme led by GATE in Sierra Leone. Specialist and complementary support roles can support inclusion in mainstream classrooms. For example, the Sightsavers itinerant specialist teacher programme in Uganda. Professionals from other sectors, such as community health workers, can promote inclusion, target the most marginalised, and support on a broader range of education outcomes, like student health and welfare and well-being. An Education Development Trust will shortly speak about their work in this area. Volunteers from the local community, national service programmes, parents and families can support in areas such as foundational learning, mother tongue instruction, connecting students to schools and supporting blended models of learning. And you will hear from Pratham on this soon. Members of the local community can also supplement lessons with applied and project-based learning, helping connect what students learn in theory in school to real-world issues and supporting the transition to work. For example, the work of Educate in Uganda and Injaz in Jordan. Next slide, please. But learning teams are not about creating a significantly more expensive workforce. They're about optimizing existing skills and expertise where possible across a team. For example, families and members of the community have a lot to offer to support children's education. The evidence around family engagement in education, albeit mainly from the US, shows that parents and caregivers can be an important ingredient in children's achievement in school. And emerging insights from the pandemic have identified parents and communities as a key resource for school leaders all over the world, providing additional expertise, knowledge, and local capacity to respond to COVID-19. And teaching at the right level programs led by community volunteers and NGO staff have consistently led to gain in learning outcomes. Learning teams can also help harness the expertise of higher performing teachers and those with specialist skills. Pairing more effective or specialist teachers with least experienced teachers, as Carol mentioned earlier, means students benefit both from the expertise of the most capable teachers, but also the support of other adults. And including trainee teachers as part of a learning team can provide better initial education through more practice and enable them to support teaching and learning. Innovative approaches to sharing shortage subject expertise across schools are also taking place. Task shifting is another way that we can help realign roles towards learning and inclusion. For example, teachers' instructional time can be increased and protected if they have support roles to undertake some of the preparation or administrative tasks. And task shifting can also help facilitate some more innovative and personalised learning configurations that better respond to individual needs. Next slide, please. But to help to make learning teams happen, strong instructional leadership is absolutely vital. And evidence shows that at the moment, school leaders spend too much time doing administration and not enough supporting teachers to teach. A greater focus on instructional leadership can be enabled by task shifting some of the administrative tasks and by using technology. A UNESCO review concluded that effective school leadership that provides instructional guidance and fosters continuous improvement is the key to successful large-scale and sustainable education reform. To do this, leaders need to transform school sites into sites of professional development and focus on data-driven school improvement. And learning teams can help facilitate this through peer collaboration, mentoring, and coaching, which all have proven to positively impact learning outcomes. Next slide, please. So learning teams are underpinned by collaboration. A systematic review of teacher collaboration concluded, when teachers collaborate, the performance of students progress, schools undergo cultural changes, are more innovative, but on a personal level, teachers seem to benefit as well. A team approach can also help establish an environment of trust and support. But as Carol has mentioned, system-wide structures and practices will need to change to create learning teams. Initial teacher education needs to be reformed to equip teachers and trainees to work in learning teams. Training, professional development, and eventually qualifications will be needed for new roles so that they can be recognised in their own right. Goals will need to be aligned across systems and teams within the system. And the workforce needs to be engaged in all of this so that they can take part in helping design what learning team works best in their context. Next slide, please. So to summarise, evidence suggests that learning team approaches can lead to more effective and personalised teaching and learning, greater access to specialist expertise, a more inclusive and holistic approach to help address student welfare and well-being, more on-the-job learning and support and better motivation, and also to build more resilient systems. Last slide, please. So why now? Well, I think you've heard from Lisbeth, Carol and Lucy that the pandemic actually has provided a brilliant opportunity to talk about learning themes and how actually they can be embedded and be more resourced within education systems. The approaches we'll hear from today and the evidence we've shared mainly come from approaches that have been designed as targeted innovations. But during the crisis response, we've seen how, as Lucy has said, these forms of learning teams have sprung up everywhere and how teachers are collaborating with other members of the community, parents and families, so no child is left behind. During the last year, systems have been disruptive and mindsets are shifting about what education design and delivery can and must look like. Now is the time to be intentional about working in teams and considering how best to integrate this learning team approach into education systems so they can improve education outcomes for all and be more resilient. Other sectors, as Lisbeth said, such as health and early childhood, have systematized team-based approaches for better cost-effectiveness, delivery and outcomes. So why not in education? So now I have the pleasure to introduce you to three people leading effective forms of learning teams. And firstly, I would like to start by introducing Deborah Cooper from the Open University, who will share the GATE programme in Sierra Leone. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you, Amy. The Girls Access to Education programme is a UK aid programme in Sierra Leone. The consortium lead is PLAN, And there, I'm going to take you through the headlines of what the different NGOs and the Open University do. And then I'm going to focus on one aspect of our teams, and that's the development of female workforce. Next slide, please. So the Plan International, as I said, is the education lead. At the Open University, we're involved in developing learning assistants and put them on a pathway to teacher training. And humanity and inclusion work, especially with itinerant teacher. This model is about promoting inclusion and with existing teachers. And they also work with community-based rehabilitation volunteers, encouraging parents to send children to school, working together with schools to do education plans. ActionAid also provide various economic projects. And the focus of all these people working together are children, and especially girls, who have not been in school, because the context in Sierra Leone is that even at primary level, retention of girls is very low, even though enrollment has gone up. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we can say is that we've been working since 2013 on this, and we're now on the second phase over 6 different districts in Sierra Leone, and we're very much focusing on the most marginalized and the rural areas where the issues of poverty are seen at their most deepest. And we work with marginalized girls at both primary and junior secondary level, and we work with children with disabilities. The Open Universities also worked with adult learners who be 18 plus, and they come from the same communities as those marginalized children. And what we're doing is approaching through our teams the barriers in access to education at multiple levels. Could I have the next slide, please? So we tackle it at the community level by supporting women to return to learn, by working with parents, as I said, to encourage them to send their children to school. And the itinerant teachers, they work in the classrooms with teachers, helping them adapt their lessons rather than send people on inclusion courses. They provide the professional development in situ. And head teachers are also encouraged to network with other head teachers. Volunteers run after school sessions. Female teachers are involved in and outside the classroom. And we are working with teacher training colleges so that we can get more women into education. Let me tell you a little bit more now about, next slide please, about the female educations that we're improving. So imagine that you know a young child who's going to school, perhaps a bit nervous, and they don't see a female teacher at all in the whole system. That's perfectly possible with those low levels of female teachers who are not coming through the system. But by giving women support to become teachers, we take it right back to why those women might have dropped out. They might have dropped out when they became pregnant. 50% of our group are mothers. So we give them study support and we help them to do the teacher training college entrance exam. And it's a vocational and study route at the same time. So part of the week they're studying to upskill themselves again and get ready for the exam. And another part of the week, they're actually in school working with teachers. Thank you. Next slide, please. And we talked earlier on about social capital, and this is really important. So if you think about Fatima, and we talk about we need a village to raise a child, well, we also need villages and communities to raise teachers, because Fatima would have the support, firstly, of her family there to become a teacher, and these communities were involved in the selection of these women who received the bursaries. And she would also, of course, have school support to go ahead. And then she'd have the support of other female learning assistants. She also works with academic tutors in maths and English to return to learn and have a second chance. Now, most of these tutors are going to be male because they are the ones who've come through the system. So there's some work there in the Saturday study sessions and the learning camps to be flexible about the young women's needs and to keep encouraging them when they're under domestic pressure to keep up with this study and learn program. And there are also planned staff on the ground in that picture. Can I have the next slide, please? So why is this particularly successful? I mean, it is an innovation in Sierra Leone. So to have somebody else in the classroom has worked very well because it has such a strong community element, as we've seen. And these women become champions for female education in their own community. They become role models, and we begin to see changes, which I'll talk about at school level. And the learning assistants have very practical training. They might take a small group, or they might do some personalized work, and they also have some materials to get them thinking about pedagogy and inclusion. And at the same time, as I said, they're improving their own study. So in that way, they're a role model. And it's really great to see that having this small bursary and being appointed to the role of learning assistants has given real recognition in this role as learning assistants return to study. Could you give me the next slide, please? Thank you. And especially it's been rewarding to see the changes in status of these women and a real pride from the community. And of course, they understand these invisible challenges that we heard about earlier. And head teachers are being very impressed with the way that they talk to pupils and the sort of caring tone that they can bring to school, and they may be known to the communities anyway. And it gives a real status to these women to be called a teacher. And we see them growing in confidence. Next slide. So as they grow in confidence towards preparing for teacher training college, they also become advocates for their community. And this has a knock-on effect on parents and other girls in the community. So it's very much the impact for the women is very much on a personal transformation level. Next slide, please. So what have we learned from doing this project? Well, as I said, it is an innovation. It is a new model in Sierra Leone. We did do it previously in Malawi, and we know that where women are underrepresented, this is a good way in, and the model is well received, because it does start to address barriers from different angles. There are geographic barriers because these women are living in the most remote rural areas. There's no chance of them going to conventional teacher college, and even the distance learning models from the colleges are out of reach to them. They're mainly male dominated, but because of domestic pressures and because of they may have just missed their school level entrance exams, they need another chance, and they need some small scholarship to help them with phone top up, with basic equipment. So those economic geographic barriers, we already know about. The cultural ones are what are we starting to address. And the career pathway is a really important part of this model, because we don't want the learning assistants to stay at assistant level. We want them to enter teacher training college and then enter the payroll. And that's what we're working towards there. We also have something to share about doing distance learning in this context. And we know that although we provided specially written books and some of the materials were on tablets, that it's not just about the technology, because the support is absolutely vital, that community support, that academic support to make sure that people get through. Our materials are all open source, and that is our model. And finally, I think we've seen that this model can be adapted to COVID. So at the moment, we have our female teachers involved in telephone tuition for children who haven't been able to come to school, and working side by side with some of those volunteers there. And I think last slide, please. I think I heard this just 2 weeks ago from someone in Port Loco who was saying how the program has changed her and how she works, letting girls come to her house in the evening to help them with their studies. And so the impact on the community at that level is absolutely huge. The final slide now, please, is our contact details. Apologies from Maggie from Plan, who couldn't be with us today, but we welcome you keeping in touch. Do have a look at our open source materials, and please do read the blog about the GATE project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think it's a great example of how both an additional role in the classroom, but also a trainee teacher actually in the classroom on a pathway to becoming a qualified teacher can be supported, and the different roles that they need to support them, particularly for women, as you say, in areas which they may otherwise not be able to take that career path. So thank you very much. Everyone listening, if you've got questions, please do put them in the chat. And then at the end of each of these case studies, I will open out to question and answer. But if you've got questions that you would like to ask, put them in the chat and we'll collate them, and I'll ask them at the end once we've heard from the other two organisations as well. But thank you, Deborah, once again. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Rukmini Banerjee, the CEO of Pratham, who will share their approach and show how teams have supported Pratham's work over many years, but also in the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you. I think you need to share Rukmini's video. Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Wonderful to be here. And it's just amazing how many commonalities we have across different programs. We may call them by different names, but I can see from the descriptions of learning teams that many of these threads are going through, these different cases. So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about what we do in Pratham. We obviously have slides which describe our work, but having heard Lucy and the GATE program, I'm going to pull out some things that I think will just help to weave this narrative together, better. If you go to the next slide, this is just to explain who we are. The name Pratham means primary or priority. And so we have worked largely over our last 2 decades on primary and pre-primary. We, of course, do a bunch of other things as well, but largely we work in how do you get children to school? How do you help them to learn well? How can this be done on scale and with the resources that communities and schools have already? So that's kind of the broad backdrop of who we are. Next slide. We work in 2 ways, and I'll talk about both of those because we seem to use this learning teams approach in both our approaches. Across the different age groups, just to think of it in this way, that the first way in which we work, we call our direct work, where there is a Pratham person interacting with the children and with the communities and with the schools, and usually leading some instructional activity as well. And the other way in which we work is in partnership with governments. And so until quite recently, our direct work was like a laboratory where you actually learned what worked, learned how to create your new teams, refined your methods, did your early measurements. And when you were convinced that this was an effective way to work, you could then take those elements and work with large partners, typically governments, but often with other organizations as well. So our direct work and our partnership work are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. But we feel very strongly in Pratham across the board that we cannot offer people anything unless you are sure about it yourself, and at some level, unless you've done it yourself. A similar approach is being used in some of the work that we are beginning to do in partnership with other countries. And my colleague Devyani Prasad is also here on this call. who maybe during the question answer session can say a little bit about how some of these approaches have moved from India into other countries as well. So moving on to the next slide. Like many of you who've already spoken, we too believe that it takes a whole community to educate a child, and therefore there have to be collaborations at whatever level you work. And I think the COVID time only highlighted all those connections even more, because when the main institution, the school, was closed, all the other pillars around that have been there all along, but perhaps have been in the shadow of the school, all came right into the sunlight. And so we could see that the work that we do, even in our direct programs, both in the community and the school, both were needed. And when one could not operate for some reason, then even more strength came from the other. And then across the board, of course, across home, neighborhood, community, school, government. But I wanted to give you one very clear example, maybe two clear examples of what we are calling learning teams in this conversation applied to us. So think about the early childhood work. We have large and growing programs in early childhood. There's a lot of logic about why we work in the early childhood space as well. But one of the main ones being that, if you want to ensure that there is no learning gaps when kids get older, perhaps the best way is to start well and to build a very strong foundation so that there is no chance of a child slipping either out of school or out of the learning net. So in our early childhood programs, in our direct early childhood programs, we think of, imagine the child at the center and the child being scaffolded by three very important pillars. One obviously is the instructor, could be in the early childhood center or in the school, because we see this as a continuum going from preschool to the first 2 grades of primary school. So obviously the person inside the school or inside the preschool center is a very important person. An equally important person we see as the young mother. I think parents are important, but in many of our contexts, the fathers are often far away at work. And so the young mother is a key person. She herself in many of our communities is not that old herself. She may be, anywhere between 18 to 22, so quite young herself. And then we see a third person who is like a older sibling to the child, maybe a middle school or a high school or just a college going young person in the community, because we feel often the home and the school needs one more sort of connecting group. And put all of these together, we see that there will be instructional activity that happens in the school, but there are mothers groups by each neighborhood, so that there is a place where young mothers come together, where the instructor can also be part of it. And then there is the young community volunteer. And the reason to construct this kind of scaffolding around the child is we often see that children will move through a school system, which may have all kinds of demands on the child, may have curriculum that is often very difficult at that grade level. But if you have this supporting structure, almost several key players around the child's life, almost like a protective ring that can move with the child as the child grows. And we have seen that this bringing the set of characters, it so happens that most of them are female. So it also highlights the importance of the young mother in the growth of this child, often in a social system where the young mother often is perhaps at the lowest of the totem pole. So this is our attempt to create what we hope will be a long run and durable learning community. We've also, in different parts of India where we are trying this, we have added on that unless you are a learner, it's very difficult to create a learning community. So the Pratham full-time person who often supports 10 villages or 20 villages, depending on where they are also often enrolled in an Open University early childhood certification course. So that part of what she's doing is, obviously working on the ground, but that she needs to get certified as well as while she's doing this. And when the school teacher or the community volunteer sees this kind of a learning and certification going on, they often want to enroll in the same courses. So we have different levels of courses as well that we attach onto this, because we feel to be a really good teacher, whether you're an instructor or a mother or a volunteer, you need to be a learner as well. And as everyone grows in these communities, we would like this kind of a community to be a kind of a lifelong learning based on the resources that you have. So I guess, I had not thought of this as a learning team. We had thought of this as how do you build a group of people around the child. But I think it fits quite well into this learning teams idea that we've been talking about. If we move to the next slide, we've put down, a whole bunch of things that we do across our programs. But I want to also take a moment to talk about how in the government partnership work, how we feel that this idea of learning teams is absolutely integral and core to the way we work. And there, the example I will use from our approach to helping children who are already in, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade or above, who still don't have foundational learning. And the instructional methodology or the pedagogical approach that we use is called teaching at the right level, TARL for short. And that is used both in India and in several other countries right now. But imagine that you want to use this approach, and I'll explain what it is, but in a very large school system. So recently we carried out a program jointly with one of our biggest states in India. It's a state which has about 120,000 primary schools. And you want this teaching at the right level, which we feel is a very effective approach to be used by every single school in such a large system. So how do you go about doing that? So a couple of things. One is the state has 75 districts. And as we embarked on the plan, we felt that the first thing to do is to create a team at the district level. So the government selected 4 people, and it was up to the government to select which 4 people they thought. All we said is if they are district leaders, and each district may have anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 schools, pick a teacher, pick a person who you feel is capable of being a leader like this. And so we had a whole bunch of people. Some were faculty from the teaching and teacher training colleges. Some were actually a teacher themselves. So it was a combination of people from the government system. And we added 2 Pratham people to this district level team. Now, in addition to working like teams, we also believe in something that we call leaders of practice, that you can't really train anybody else, you can't orient anybody else until you yourself have done what is required, what you are going to require other people to do. I guess, this is not a new approach. You call it mentoring in some places, be the change that you want to be and so on. And so each of these people, that was about 300 people, went off and used the teaching at the right level approach for about 20 days in their own schools. And the reason for doing 20 days is also important because during that time, you can see that in 20 days time, if you start at the level of the child, then you're able to actually get quite a bit of progress. And so in front of your own eyes, you begin to have the belief that I am able to bring about this change. You don't do it alone. We had 2 of these people in each school do it together. And you need to do it together because you're going to move away from what I think Carol was talking about, this age grade construction of schools. If you move away from that and you say that in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, let me look at kids who are still struggling to read words or letters, those who are able to read sentences, but not longer level text. And so across, if you think of the school as organized by rows, by age and grade, and think of columns as different levels of reading, then we had to mix up the 3rd, 4th, 5th grades, pick out the children at the similar levels, reallocate the teachers from being in rows into being in charge of columns. And then when you do this, you find that if you start at the level of the child, kids move from one level to the next very quickly. And so in 20 days time, they may have jumped 2 levels so that there's really nobody left at the lower level. So this requires a team structure, both at the school level, children as teams, teachers as teams, but to support so many schools, you actually require a team that is working together to get this done. So every one of these people who had a successful practice period, we consider a leader of practice, and then they would do the same thing to the layer below them. And eventually these 120,000 schools were steered, guided, supported, and helped by about 4,000 people. And this entire thing, if you think of it, was teams at different levels working together. When we were doing this, we were very focused about this creating of leaders of practice. But as I see it, it's leaders of practice working as learning teams. And the two together, we saw in a period of about 2 months, a good, strong 20 percentage point improvement in what children were able to do. So very quickly, moving on to the next slide, this is to show you that, I've already spoken about this, that we always do things both in the school, in the community, whether we are doing it directly ourselves or with, the kinds of teams I've been talking about. We, during the COVID school closure time, we do this annual status of education report, the ASER survey. We've been doing it for 15 years. It's now done in many other countries as well. And this time we asked who helps whom at home. And you can see that even at home, there are teams at work, whether it's siblings, whether it's mothers or fathers. People were during this time engaging with children to help them to go ahead. So all in all, I don't want to take up any more time. If we just go to the last, I think it's the last slide, that, in trying to summarize how do teams work together, I think that, you have to include people as part of the pathway going towards a solution. But in that pathway, we have learned that if you don't understand the problem, you can't come up with a solution. And to bring people, whether it is parents, whether it is other teachers along, you have to use very simple tools and methods that helps you engage, see the problem for yourself, and then together talk about what solutions can be. Our leaders of practice that I spoke about, I think you have to build the belief and the first-hand experience that substantial change is possible in a short period of time, because many of our people have been stuck in very low equilibrium systems. And so this leaders of practice and the fact that you're not alone, you're working in a team. And overall, I think building participation and ownership is a key part of bringing about any kind of change. And so I think the last point I'll say is, we think teaching at the right level is a very effective way to help children come out of their sort of the low level in which they are stuck. And to do that, you have to be able to reach out to many people at their own level and bring them to be part of a team. So I think that's it from us here in Pratham. Just want to make sure I haven't left any slides out. People have worked hard on these slides, but over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. You brought out two really key points about learning teams there. One, that they really need to happen at every level in the system. So school level, district level, and even state and national level. It's really key. And then the second one being that it's not just about the learning of children, it's about the learning of all of those within the team, and that they should be able to support the goal of lifelong learning. So thank you so much for sharing that. And again, if anyone wants to put any questions for Rukmini in the chat, please do, and I will note them and I'll ask them when we get to the Q&A session. So finally, I would like to introduce Tony McAlevey from Education Development Trust, who's going to tell us about some of the work they've been doing with community health volunteers to support their work in education in Kenya. So Tony, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy. Hello, everybody. Great to be here. My name is Tony McAlevey. I'm the Research Director at Education Development Trust. And as Amy said, I'm going to say a little bit about the extended learning team concept that we've been developing with community health volunteers in Kenya. So next slide, please. Let me explain a little about who we are. Education Development Trust, it's an international not-for-profit organization. We work to improve education outcomes around the world. We've been in existence since the 1960s, and we used to be called, slightly confusingly, CFBT Education Trust. We changed our name a few years ago, Education Development Trust. Headquartered in the UK, but working all over the world. Essentially, we do two or three things. We work with governments to design and deliver school improvement interventions, scale, We provide consultancy on different facets of the reform of school systems, and we undertake educational research, with a particular focus on the identification of promising practice in school reform. And almost all of our research is freely available via our website. And please do check it out. And recently we've been doing a lot of work looking at promising policy responses to the COVID pandemic. A couple of concrete examples about what we do. We've got a substantial portfolio of work in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to talk about our Girls Education Challenge work in Kenya. But we're also working on national reform programs in other African countries, in Rwanda, in Ethiopia. In MENA, in Jordan, we're working with the ministry and the UNICEF on something called a Learning Bridges project, supporting schools to maintain learning continuity for 1 million students during the COVID emergency. We work in low income, middle income, high income contexts. In England, we work closely with the Department for Education. And we're involved at the moment, for example, in a national program to provide training for early career teachers within the context of a new research-based framework relating to early career professionalism. And I think there are some learning team elements in many of these interventions. So our work in England is based on a recognition of the need for training based on clarity about role specificity within the school team. In Rwanda, we're developing a new role, the consultant head teacher who works across a cluster of schools, still working as a head teacher back at base, but also working across a family of schools, promoting the professional learning of peer head teachers. And we're really delighted, by the way, these consultant head teachers have been able to mobilize their peers as part of the recent Back to School campaign. So next slide, please. With funding from the UK government, we work with the Ministry of Education in Kenya, supporting the learning engagement of marginalized girls in some of the country's most disadvantaged communities, urban slums in Nairobi and Mombasa, and the so-called ASALs, the arid and semi-arid lands, which are remote rural areas. And today I'm going to talk about our COVID response. But the approach that I'm going to describe predates the crisis. It goes back to a project that started in 2013. And before the crisis, we had really promising impact data relating to the way the approach was engaging girls and the outcomes as measured, not just in terms of school enrollment and completion, but also in terms of literacy and numeracy skills. Next slide, please. We endorse the key messages of the Education Commission report on the transformation of the education workforce. And we like a lot the concept of the learning team. And as you will know, the report sent out, and Amy's referred to this, a series of visions, really. And the ultimate vision is one where there are networks of schools whose work is underpinned by a strong cross-sectoral partnership. And today I'd like to highlight an example of what such strong cross-sectoral partnerships might look like, with reference to our work in Kenya, where education and health specialists work together. Next slide, please. Our approach formalizes a partnership between school professionals and a cadre of Kenyan health workers known as community health volunteers, CHVs. The term volunteer is a slight misnomer, as many of them are actually paid a small stipend. Now, the CHVs were an existing resource. They've been part of the Kenyan health system since the 1970s. And the main duties from the beginning of the CHVs were to visit homes to determine the health situation at household level, to promote key health messages, and to work with community leaders on key health interventions. Now, our 2013 project sought to establish a new synergy between schools and CHVs as part of our attempt to reach out to marginalized girls, their families, and communities. Next slide, please. And since 2013, we've been able to redefine the responsibilities of the CHVs, combining health and education accountabilities, and more formally connecting their work to that of the education system. So they're responsible for identifying vulnerable children at household level, providing families with advice on healthy living practices, referrals to health services, tracking girls, individual girls who've missed school and encouraging attendance. And the result has been that overall the CHVs, they become a key source of data for the education system as well as the health system, able to often take proactive steps at household and community level to encourage engagement with schools. Next slide, please. The value of the work of the CHVs has been highlighted over the past year. During the recent prolonged period of school closure, the CHVs worked closely with education professionals to encourage home learning. They encouraged girls to listen to radio broadcasts and acted as intermediaries for the distribution and collection of hard copy learning materials and assignments. This diagram illustrates how the system worked. High-tech solutions were impractical in this highly disadvantaged context. Instead, the solution combined low-tech, no-tech components. Low-tech in the form of the radio broadcasts, and no-tech through the use of workbooks, which were distributed by the CHVs and collected for marking by them. Next slide, please. I think clarity of expectations is important for different members of the learning team. During the period of school closure, we formally redefined additional responsibilities, incentivizing with modest cash payments these additional responsibilities, which included the following: monitoring the participation of individual girls in distance learning, promoting the idea of the benefits of learning continuity with parents and community leaders, delivering the learning packs for home learning, and enabling the educational professionals at a distance to mark and return work undertaken at home. Next slide, please. The impact data has been very encouraging, and we believe that the community health volunteers have made a substantial contribution to the management of the school closure crisis. Our researchers undertook a household survey in order to measure learning engagement during school closure. Parents and caregivers were asked to estimate how much time their girl children spent each day on schoolwork, despite the closure of the schools. Households responding to our survey indicated that 90% of girls in the arid and semi-arid lands were spending more than 2 hours a day on learning, and 79% of girls in urban areas were achieving this level of learning continuity. And these levels of continued engagement compare well, for example, with rates of learning engagement of disadvantaged students in the UK during school closure. The difference between the rural and urban areas is instructive. It's probably a variety of factors, including a greater degree of community cohesion and solidarity in the rural areas. So there are still problems, and some of the girls not engaged. But despite these problems and limitations, we consider that the cross-sectoral learning team approach proved to be one of the most useful and one of the most resilient features of the education system during the period of school closure. Next slide, please. So that's me finished. If you'd like to know more about our evaluation of the role of the CHVs or anything else, please check out our website. And also the report, the evaluation is there in its own right. So here are the key addresses, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. I think it's been fascinating the way that you have been able to have such a strong partnership between health and education to serve both health and education outcomes. So in the questions, I might ask you a bit more about how that came about. But I just wanted to say that Education Development Trust worked with us on this learning teams concept as part of the Transforming the Education Workforce report. So we really appreciated all of your thinking and contributing to this concept. So now I would like to give you all who've been listening the opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. I think Lucy will join us as well. Just to understand, for you to ask questions to help your understanding of perhaps how we could take this further to scale, how we could systematize it within education systems. I see a couple of questions have come through, so I will open on asking those, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions. But do please keep your questions coming. We invited all of you because we've had some discussion or known you had some interest in learning teams. So the first couple of questions are really around sustainability and I guess adoption of learning team approaches. And The first one was about the GATE project in Sierra Leone, Deborah, and about to what extent, or what is the route to sustainability for the programme? I guess both in working with teacher training institutions and teacher training colleges, and in the women graduating from the programme, you know, working in schools. So would you be able to answer that one first?
Yeah, I think you can look at it at different angles, as we talked earlier on about being bottom up, and certainly from a community point of view, this is very much, you know, welcome to see more women in schools and to see women, particularly because this is a sort of grow your own model. So we're not talking about moving resources around on a spreadsheet and bringing people in from urban areas who then go home on the Friday afternoon. They live there all the time. So from a community level, it's very much welcomed. I think there is some further work to do at teacher training level and reforms there to look at the barriers to entry to teacher training college. And I think in terms of finances, the actual bursary that we gave to the women was quite small, and the issue is around supporting them all the way, really. But as schools have certainly become more used to working in teams and seeing people, you know, and opening up their classrooms, so I think there's a lot of scope there, but there's still some work to do. Thank you.
It would also be good, Tony, to hear from you about how you're working with the Ministry of Health around, I guess, how did that partnership come about, and how is that model sustainable? Like how is the time, for example, paid by the community health workers to support education? I'd just be interested to hear about that.
Sure. I think it's an instructive story in terms of harnessing of existing resource, so that there's a cost, but it's a relatively small marginal cost, and the return on investment, if you like, of that modest cost is quite considerable, because you know, it's a kind of multiplier effect, because these folks were there already. And the synergy, bringing together of, if you like, already existing resource in the schools, in the health system, generates this great benefit, I think. So it's a question of understanding, if you like, well, the system as it is, and what resources are there, and how we can harness those existing resources, perhaps with some additional marginal investment. And we were very fortunate in that we've actually been we've had the privilege of working in Kenya for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And so our colleagues really understand the ecosystem. And it's a question of, well, what is the specific, you know, political economy in part around here? And it depends on relationships and getting to know people. And it was also an application, if you like, of the theory, because when we were designing our intervention, you know, understandably, we looked to the international literature about effective interventions for vulnerable girl children. And, you know, not surprisingly, the literature says that cross-sectoral approaches, integrated approaches, multi-agency approaches are very promising. So we brought together, if you like, the research plus what we knew about the system.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. And just to ask, I'll leave this open as to who would like to respond, but one person has asked, to what extent have ministries of education taken on board, either in terms of adapting teacher training or perhaps new roles or new ways of working as a result of the work you've been doing? So Rukmini, you obviously talked about heavily working with district officials. How did you get that buy-in, and how did you get that state and district to commit time from their people to transition to this, you know, more team-based and teaching at the right level approach?
So I think there are several shifts that were needed. Firstly, and again, I can't speak outside of the experience of India, but you're coming from a system which has focused largely on how to expand provision and how to provide for more teachers, more schools, very input oriented. And so I would say that the processes to keep a input oriented system in place are very different from when you are needing to support children's learning. And so while I think that people accept that the work on enrollment and provisioning has gone quite far, but these internal dynamics of when you have to inspect a building, you can perhaps use a checklist. But when you have to support the growth of children and the scaffolding by teachers, maybe a checklist is not as useful as actually firsthand experience. So, and I know this is a problem in many of the sub-Saharan countries where, my colleagues are beginning to work, is that there isn't provision made for people to travel from school to provide support. And so, how do you make this whole business that the teaching and learning is quite dynamic? For me to be able to help you, it's not just you come to training college and get trained and then you're out there by yourself. How do I come to your class quite frequently and see what your problems are? How do we as a team of 10 schools help each other? I think these are all go well beyond teaching at the right level. I think they go from in my mind, they go from moving from a system which focused largely on having every child in school to now focusing on how do you get every child to learn. In addition to that, I would say that this distance from home and school, in India, almost half of our children have mothers who didn't have much schooling themselves. And so you are actually quite nervous to approach a school and actually I can go and talk about why did my daughter not get a scholarship? What about her entitlement for uniforms? But it's much harder for me to go and say, okay, what do I do about, 2-digit subtraction? So the early childhood part that I described, I think that people being together, really helps because you get strength from each other. You're not a mom acting alone. You have your friends with you. And you also have sometimes, and I think this is common across all our programs, the community volunteer is often an alumni of the same school. So she's kind of halfway, between us. So, I'm not saying that everybody just accepts this notion of teams. The notion of leaders of practice is often accepted in principle and often very difficult to push into practice. And if at all we hold our ground when we are talking to governments, we are very, two things. One is that you have to give people, the trainers, time to practice it themselves. And two is that you have to give whoever has trained the opportunity to be able to support the schools. So that training is seen as step 0 and not as the only step. And it's really in this evolve. And once this team has done its stuff in one phase, you learn so many things that almost automatically people want to do it again at maybe a higher level because you know where you succeeded, you know where you failed. So I think it's something that you have to have some missionaries in the system. And I think Deborah spoke about that as well. That, who are the champions, and you've got to make the champions, Olympic champions next, and because they'll carry the other people with them.
Thank you, Rukmini. We've had a question around what has been the reaction of teachers to either having other roles, work with them or support them, and whether it affected, I guess, the definition of their role. So I might ask Deborah that to start with, because the learning assistants would have been working directly in the classroom with teachers, and then invite anyone else to add.
Thank you. Yes, I think in each of these schools where the learning assistants were working, they were supported by their head teachers or a senior teacher, so that people understood that having someone in the classroom wasn't about the teacher then disappearing to go and do something else, but it took some change to work in teams, and that these young women were becoming teachers, that they're not yet teachers. So there was some advice given about doing work with small groups or preparing resources and so on. And I think it helps that the itinerant teachers used the same sort of in-school model. So they were showing teachers how to use local resources to adapt materials in a very hands-on way for children with disabilities, and doing work about particular children who might have had behavioural difficulties, so they could see that disability is not just about physical disabilities. So I think it's a drip feed over time of people working together, building up trust and so on. And I think it does help that, for the learning systems, that they came from the community and unknown.
Thank you. And Tony, what about you? How did it work with the teachers trusting the health workers to maintain this continuity of learning?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I think we shouldn't make naive assumptions about how easy this is, and I think we need to take intentional action. Simply providing a new resource isn't necessarily going to be welcomed by folks. They may think, hang on a minute, are they meant to be teachers? I thought I was the teacher. They may see it as a threat to their professionalism. They may think, don't these people know how hard I'm working? They're asking me to do. So I think you need to do what we did was a kind of risk analysis, if you like. How will this go wrong? And put an emphasis on training, so that there's a real socialization of the approach, but not in a turn up at the workshop, we'll tell you how it's going to work way. You need maybe some of that, but more a kind of problem solving collaborative approach to the new approach. So I think clarity about getting the professional learning right is really important. And then I'd emphasize in particular the pivotal role of the school principal as the person who you need to get on board as the champion of the team approach, who will promote it, but also monitor it and quality assure it and explain it to parents who are maybe a little bit, parents can be very conservative about changes. So I'd emphasize the right approach to training and socialization and the role of the head teachers.
Great, thank you. And we've had a follow-on question, which I'll ask you, Lucy, to start with, about what do you think the particular policy hurdles are to creating team-based models? I know you do a lot of work with governments as part of your work. How have you addressed any specific policy hurdles, and what do you think some initial steps could be taken to help consider how to work in a team-based way more systematically?
Thanks, Amy. I would pick up on 2 points in relation to that. I think one is having, and this is picking up on some of Tony's points, having a very clear definition to the respective roles within learning teams. And so in our case, looking at the learner guide, being very clear that this isn't a role that is an additional unqualified teacher within the system, because I think that in itself creates great demand and issues for the young woman who's in that position. And so I think having those real clarity of the different roles within the learning team is fundamental. But the other side of it, as I would say, is the costing issue. I think having very clear, detailed costing analysis of what's involved in a learning team in order to be able to consider how and which costs and in which way are applicable within the school system and beyond the school system and can be captured under other budgets, including in health, for example. So that very detailed costing analysis, I would say for us, has been at the core of the kind of policy discussions that we've been able to progress.
Great, thank you. Rukmini or Deborah or Tony, would you like to add anything to that question?
So I don't know if I'm addressing the policy challenge. I see a lot of institutional challenges. we work in largely hierarchical systems where, let's say, even at the state level or the district level, there is, if I look at, for example, our teacher training faculties often have not been in the classroom for a long time. And so when you bring into play this leaders of practice, often the most successful trainers and the leaders of teachers become people who have practiced really well. And I think this upsets systems a bit, and I think it's the right kind of upset, because you need the teachers that begin to demand that send these people who really know how to help me in my classroom and are able to solve my problems. Data has helped a great deal in this. I think, to me, good use of data is firstly, it brings some, you're able to highlight what is happening in the classroom, which is often invisible to people who are far away. But you're also able to show that, as a team, we were able to do this. So in India, we have a layer called a cluster coordinator who has about, anywhere between 10, 15 schools. And a lot of the discussion at that level is between my cluster and your cluster, and, who needs more help and so on. So I think that depending on at what level the progress of the program is reviewed, you can actually bring in this, the discussion of data brings in also, different aspects of this teamwork. So it's not a smooth process, but I still feel that if you want to move towards learning being the core of this, you have to shake up a system which was structured for something else. The big fight is on curriculum, because this, a large part of the learning crisis, according to me, is because of what Land Pritchett calls the negative consequences of an overambitious curriculum. And so much of this teaching at the right level is saying, get the foundations right. So who made the curriculum and for whom? And often teachers will say, why were we not consulted on what is okay with the... So I mean, I'm a great believer that some amount of questioning and disruption it's easier to do that as a team, much more difficult as an individual.
Great, thank you very much. So I'd like to ask a question now about technology and how technology can support working within a team. And there's a specific question to start with for you, Deborah, about how technology was used as part of the GATE program and how you ensured it was reliable. And then I'll open it out to others. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have to think about technology that's appropriate for the context. So for the learning assistants, when we gave them this specially written book so they could get their maths and English up to speed for teacher training colleges, they initially asked, is it okay if I write in it? Even though it had been designed with space in it, because it was the first time that they'd been able to write in their own book. So in that context, the technology of the book and the pen was really important. We later put some of that material onto tablets, and there are issues about charging and the cost it costs to charge them. But by having things on tablets, we were able to put a lot more OER from our TESA and our TES India programs and so on to sort of widen out. And similarly, you can see that in COVID, the ministry had a catch-up program on radio, but for many children, the radio doesn't even reach the hardest to the furthest away regions because of transmission problems and so on. And we're starting to use telephone tuition now. It is a pilot. Because the child doesn't have her own phone, and so that needs to be pre-arranged, and the family have to be on board, and they might need the phone for their own work in the market and so on. So I think there are some challenges in technology, but obviously lots of the learning assistants, the young women are using WhatsApp and they're using phones to communicate with each other, to film each other, little practice clips and so on. So there's great potential, I think, there. But we also have to be realistic about what the extremely challenges are in that low resource environment.
Thank you. Would any others of you like to comment on how technology is helping learning teams?
Just to really endorse what Deborah said about the appropriate, realistic technology in terms of the story just now with the CHVs in Kenya. I mean, we all know this, maybe I'm just stating the obvious, but policymakers, I'm not in Kenya, just like a global phenomenon, they like the glamour of high technology. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the global story just now is the kind of the resurgence of the low technology. I mean, Deborah's right. Even that's not accessible to many millions of children. But you know, our community health volunteers SMS texting data about participation levels of individual girls, creating data using that relatively low tech, encouraging at household level the families to let the girl listen to the radio if they've got a radio. I think that's made a big difference.
Thank you. Rukmini, did you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add an angle that we've seen playing out, and I think in a more obvious way during the pandemic, is that when you have the teams with mixed age groups, often, for example, in this instructor, mother, and community volunteer grouping, it's often the young teenager who is more curious about using technology and then bringing that benefit to the others. So we see technology, we see this, the potential of technology as a trigger, as opposed to it being, kind of the digital content being the end to the means, or I don't know, I'm getting mixed up here with my own metaphors. But I think that we've seen across the board, even within Pratham, we had to do a very accelerated learning for getting everybody onto being comfortable with devices and with the remote activity. And, you could see almost everybody said, I'm glad my son was home, my daughter was home, because I didn't know how to do this, I didn't know how to do that. So in many ways, it turns the tables on the usual hierarchies. We find that giving our young mothers even a shared device, raises their prestige in the community, because this woman has a device that often the men folk in her family doesn't have. So the social structure onto which the technology lands, I think, is very key. And the feedback that comes back, I think, is also important. So I feel like, in addition to the fact that through COVID, we've learned that, radio or SMS is still quite useful. I think what we've learned is that the social structures onto which particularly shared things landed was very powerful in bringing the group together in a new way. And I see this across. We've done a lot of the similar trainings with our government folks, where the actual training may be maybe on whatever pedagogy, but the person who's part of the workshop says, I'm now regarded as the person who can connect others to the rest of the world. So my value has gone up.
That's absolutely fascinating. I hadn't really considered that, the impact of the social structure and the device on the social standing. That's fascinating. Thank you. So I just want to encourage others to submit questions before I ask the next one, but please do submit a couple more questions. We'll have time for 2 to 3 more. So one person has asked, can we start with one piece of the learning teams model? And could that, for example, be volunteer community learning assistance, for example? And they were asking what incentives are given to volunteers to sustain their contribution. So I will ask that maybe to Lucy to start with, and then or Rukmini, you go ahead if you like to first.
We've been playing with this idea in different forms over time, and it's called education for education. So if you give some time for, say, the younger kids in your neighborhood, then what can you get back in return, not in terms of money, but in terms of something which is learning for you. And this, we used to do this some years ago with kind of just learning Microsoft Office. We've moved to a whole variety of things. But I think the notion is quite powerful. And again, we don't expect that somebody will be a volunteer forever. But, I often say that, Teach for India or Teach for America is somebody from far away who comes in. This is actually just teach for your own neighborhood, which is a lot easier to do. There is a sense in which that I have to give back, as well. So our education for education kind of idea, I think it has quite a bit of traction, and that you hand over, it's like a relay race. So when you feel you've done a couple of months, you've gotten your course, you hand it over to your friend, because in a way you must have this regenerative, I feel the durability comes not from the same person being in it forever, but from, there is a refreshing, change that people can bring. So right now, for example, just as a quick example, we are doing, as part of education for education, especially in our early years programs, we are doing a first aid course. Very unusual in India to have a first aid course available in the community, which is being done partly on WhatsApp and partly on Zoom and partly on any shared device that you have. And I'm curious to see, because with some of our other courses, once the community volunteers have done it, that the instructors demand it as well, because there is very little adult learning opportunities outside of training that is available to our, whoever wants to learn some more. So it's almost like the education for education is like a little trailer of the possibilities that may come. And we want not just community volunteers, but people in the community to say, geez, I want to learn about this whole first aid business as well. So that hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping that it will, catch on.
Fantastic, thank you. Lucy, how do you incentivize your learner guides?
Sure. I mean, well, I think there's 3 points I'd pick up on, but just going back to the first part of the question as well, around whether you can take one dimension of this. I mean, I do think it is important to be able to drill down and show the different components, and that goes back to the point around costing the different components as well, because I think that they become more digestible if you can, and to show the value of the synergy among them. But in terms of the sustainable incentive, that has been a critical dimension to thinking about how this can be integrated and adopted at scale within government systems. And I would say there's sort of 3 approaches that we've taken to that. One is very much along the lines of what Rukmini has just shared, and what we've kind of considered social interest. It's almost like you have had an investment, you've had opportunities opened out for you, and this is a way to be able to reinvest in having taken receipt of those opportunities. So I think exploring that dimension is of value. Related to that is that often what we found is that within other ministries there are programs related to opening up opportunities for young people in the transition on from school, some kind of civic engagement and service opportunities that are there, or opening up low interest access to low interest financial resources. And I think some of these opportunities for young people can be tagged into this kind of give back into the education system approach. So that engagement with other ministries is critical. And then thirdly, for us, what has been vital, and I think others, including Deborah, have alluded to this kind of opportunity, is the accreditation piece. I think finding ways in which these roles can be accredited if the standards of engagement have been achieved does allow for a stepping stone into formal teacher training or into other forms of employment. And I think that accreditation is a really valuable dimension to the incentive, and one that can be scaled.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. So one final question I'm going to ask you. It's been fantastic to have all of you here today sharing, I guess, your take on learning teams. I know you've been running your programs for many years, so it's trying to think about how they support this concept. But how do you think we can use this opportunity in time really to create a tipping point to encourage governments, implementing organisation, teachers, parents, families to really think about this team-based approach? And what do you think that we as the Commission and practitioners, researchers can do to to create perhaps a community of practice or transformation. And I will pick up on a question that was asked about the media. What role could the media play? So does anyone have any initial thoughts on that?
I guess if I could have first go, it's a very obvious observation, but this clearly, this terrible moment in human history is an opportunity for us to think in practical terms how we're going to do things differently. So everybody's, sharing the rhetoric of building back better, but well, how are we going to build back better? How are we going to make sure that the new system is better than that system before? Because it wasn't that brilliant for many, many kids. So for sure, there is an opportunity that there ought to be on the part of people of goodwill, policymakers of goodwill, a degree of receptivity to some creative thinking just now.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have any suggestions on how we do that? Rukmini or Lucy, go for it.
Well, I mean, I would say that I think there is a real opportunity, and through the media, to pick up on some of the narratives of the day. So I think what we've seen recently is a lot of discourse around the fact that women are carrying a lot of the burden of the pandemic in relation to childcare, in relation to support and to schooling. And so I think there is a real opportunity to lift that and recognise the role that many women are playing in support for education, and what more resource and additional learning support do they need. And so I think there are entry points to this issue that we can find in the current narrative that is within the media, to be able to make the case for learning teams and to bring recognition and value to the role that others have been playing over this period. So I think it is a real moment to pick up on some of those narratives.
Great, thank you.
I agree with what's been said, and I think it's also a moment to tell some of the invisible stories through the media of those children who have not had access and who are more subject to violence and safeguarding issues, but also who've shown great initiative and creativity in trying to find different ways to learn despite the circumstances.
Thanks, Deborah. And Rukmini?
If I can just pick up on Tony's question about how do you build back better and how can this learning teams approach be integrated? To me, there's a very, very straightforward way. One is that, because at least maybe, I'm talking about India where schools have been closed for a whole year and we are not holding children back. So our new school year begins in April. And so, last March when schools closed, you were in 3rd grade, should have gone into 4th grade in April 2020. And in April 21, you're going to be in 5th grade. So it's absolutely obvious that I cannot pick up the 5th grade textbook and teach it to these kids because they had a pretty indifferent 3rd grade and no 4th grade whatsoever. And yet, if we acknowledge the fact that there's this big catch up is going to be needed, not just for the last 1 year, but for, whatever was the condition before. I just go back to the fact that earlier, I, as a 3rd grade teacher, had to deal with my 3rd grade textbook and whoever was in my so-called 3rd grade class, where there were kids all the way from 3rd grade till kindergarten in terms of levels of, whatever the basic learning was. And I was supposed to deal with all of that myself. Now, because we have this horrible period, and I often refer to this, that there's a new demon and you can blame the demon for everything. I will put aside, I hope our governments do that, put aside the 4th and 5th grade textbook and say, let's just go back to make sure that everybody remembers how to read. And if not, let's teach them. And that I have to do as a team because I'm moving from my row of being age, grade, and tied to my curriculum to the columns where there may be kids at different levels and they're not at that different age. And so if as 3 teachers, I can do this, and our job is to get everybody in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, at least up to the basic foundation level, I can't do it alone. It's much more efficient for me to do it as a team. So the policy decision has to be put aside your grade level curriculum and hit this goal. There was a question from Madhu Ranjan in the chat about the new education policy. We have a new education policy in India, which says, get to the foundational learning goals. And that's a golden opportunity for us, using that and the fact that, COVID disrupted schools in such a bad way, to say, you've got to do something different. So the different is put your curriculum aside and do it as a team.
Thank you so much, Rukmini. And just a final comment I wanted to share from Brent Madden from ASU, who has shared practically what they're doing in the US context to make it happen. And he says there are several points of entry. So one, placing teacher candidates in 2s or 3s with 1 or more professional educators to create teams. 2, working with community educators as members of the team with very clear roles and ideally pathways for professional roles. 3, building 1 to 2 team-based models in single schools so that you have a demonstration of how this could work and networking those teams together. And then finally, focusing on building cohorts of leaders who are interested and able to build these teams of professionals to work together. So I thought they were a very helpful summary of some potential entry points to take this forward. So I will hand back over to Lisbeth to wrap up, but thank you all very much.
Great, thank you so much. And I am left with the impossible task of actually summarizing what you've all said. But I will actually try, because I think this is such a fascinating conversation. And I also think that we are coming together around a kind of common set of issues, and that helping to make those issues come to life is going to be the start of the transformation. And I just, in a sort of quick summary, I would say I heard in the very beginning this concept of simultaneous renewal. I think it was Carol who said it, which kind of says we need to be changing at all levels. And that brings us immediately to this idea of systems, of course. And it's not just kind of creating these teams across all the levels of the system, but also actually creating them within the levels and going backwards, going into teacher education and going into the pipeline of people who are coming into the profession. So there's sort of almost a horizontal and a vertical way of bringing things together and creating that change. And I think all these examples about bringing so young people into this as agents of change, I think is really important and something we need to pay greater attention to. The other issue that came up a lot, which we would like to pay more attention to, is this cross-sectoral issue. I thought the example that we heard about from the healthcare workers and how they've been used all of a sudden to help progress education goals is really important to keep in mind and move on in the future. The point of leadership came back again and again, and I really loved Rukmini's Olympic champions. I think there's an issue of identifying change leaders. So who are our champions and can we make them Olympic champions? But then there is also just leadership writ large, instructional leadership, as Amy was saying. In each and every case, we need to reorient leaders towards learning and not kind of simply ticking administrative boxes. And again, within that leadership, I think the role of young people is really important, and those who are entering the system could really rise to help things change. I also heard the word data quite a lot, not only to know what's happening in classrooms, Rukmini, you emphasized that, but also, thank you, Lucy, how much does it cost? And that is something I worry about a lot, costing and financing. If we could get to a place where we can also demonstrate that this approach doesn't necessarily need to cost more, and in fact could be more efficient in many cases, because the current arrangement is not producing any learning. So if we actually get more learning out of, even if it costs a little more, the effectiveness of it will be so much greater. And I think finally, I was thinking about this issue of how do we create a transformation and the tipping point. And throughout the conversation, we keep saying it's very context specific. We need to really think about a particular context to talk about learning teams. But I think we have today realized that there is a lot of commonality as well. And trying to codify that commonality, I think, is really important to make sure that we can create a message that transcends our individual projects and ideas. So if we can somehow bring that together under an umbrella, so we are all doing, whether it's the pratams or the work that's going on with the healthcare workers, we can sort of bring it all under a kind of under the same umbrella and communicate that in an effective way. And again, Rukmini, I thought your columns and your the sort of rows and columns go from focusing on levels, your rows, rather focus on the children who, I suppose, the sort of different levels that children are at is really important here as well. So we need to try and aggregate things. That's something that we will be thinking about a lot, and communicating this new way of doing things and using the media for this, I think, is a really good idea. Just to final reflection is, we are seeing India returning to school in April, and in other parts of the world there will be returns to school at different points in the year. Maybe one thing we could consider is launching some kind of campaign that really identifies which countries are opening when, and kind of reiterate this message each time that a country opens up. That might be a way of kind of keeping the drumbeat basically going. So I'd just finally want to say thank you so much. The Education Commission is really committed to trying to create this transformation and this momentum, and really very much working with you all on doing is what we're trying to do is aggregate both through the research that we are doing and kind of looking at what the evidence out there is, bringing that together in ways that is easy to access, including this codification is one of the things that we are really trying to clarify. We also are working in some countries to test new approaches, and many of these countries and the country cases are actually in partnership with all of you. And we want to document that to be able to then do the third thing, which is this global change, this global transformation. And we are still looking for ideas as to how we can do that final bit effectively, because it's great to have everything happening in the different countries, but at the end of the day, we need to get to a place where globally everybody is talking about this and everybody is moving in that direction. So we're looking for leveraging a sort of network of champions also at the global level to drive the dialogue forward. So thank you so much. We've passed time with 3 or 4 minutes, and for some of you, it's already quite late. Thank you for those of you in Asia. And we are looking forward to continuing this conversation.